Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are.
Welcome to the Books That Make You show. I'm your host, Desiree Duffy, and we're talking about books that make you go back in time to Oklahoma in the 1940s. Books that have that strong sense of place, time, family, home, and all of the love, laughs, and the drama that goes along with it. Those are some of the ones that make us just want to curl up on the porch on a rocking chair, sip some sweet tea while reading a book. And our guest today does just that with her book, Henderson House. Caren Simpson McVicker tells a tale about an enchanting boarding house that has a couple of sisters and some secrets and a later in life romance. Henderson House invites readers to lose themselves in the heartaches and the hopes of 1940s in the state of Oklahoma. Born in Oklahoma, Caren lives in Vermont today with her husband, a rescue pup, and a barn cat that has turned into a house kitty. Oh, I know all about those kind of kitties. Let me tell you. Caren is also a mom to two incredible humans, and she is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. Henderson House is her first novel. Caren, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Desiree. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you. It just brings back, it harkens to a time when things were simpler, but very different. And we have some of our expectations in life that were just very, very different. So how about if you tell us in your own words, if you would, the setting of Henderson House? Give us the overview.
So, Henderson House is the name of a boarding house in Bartlesville, Oklahoma in the 1940s. And a question I get all the time is, was it a real boarding house? And it is a fictitious boarding house that I created, but it is based on a real family story from my family about my great aunt Boo Boo, who was an old maid in her 40s, working for Phillips Petroleum, living in a boarding house in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, when she had a love at first sight experience and fell in love with a divorced man who became a lodger in the boarding house, and how that love just changed the rest of her life.
And there's a few of those expectations, those things that we just don't really have nowadays that much. We don't call women old maids. We don't have boarding houses. We have Airbnb. So for those in the audience who might be listening and watching who are like, what's a boarding house? What's an old maid? Can you set that up for us a little bit?
Yes. And I think, the expectations really used to be that a woman would marry in her 20s. Mm-hmm. If you even got to be in your late 20s, people would start to consider you either, a spinster, which in the story, my lead character, Bessie, decides that she's no longer an old maid. She's going to consider herself a spinster because she likes the sound of that a little better. But certainly a woman who is unmarried by the time they reach 40, the expectation is that they would never marry. And boarding houses, I think I would love to see the boarding house have a resurgence because I know where I live in Vermont, we have a housing crisis, and it would be great to have wonderful community lodging for people. But the idea behind a boarding house would be someone would take their family home and they would rent their rooms to tenants, and they would also provide some level of meal service. In this case, Mrs. Henderson provides breakfast and dinner 7 days a week. And that was very common in the boarding houses. And it's just a really interesting time in history. And in 1941, boarding houses were definitely phasing out. This would have been at the end of the boarding house era. And I think at the height, probably starting at the turn of the century, certainly through the Depression. But by 1941, the boarding house was a little bit on its way out.
Yeah, I think you're right. Being able to bring something like that back, that would really be magical, wouldn't it? And
Mhm.
probably something that we need too nowadays. Tell us a little bit. You were, of course, inspired by growing up in Oklahoma, but there's also the story about these tottering sisters in a cemetery. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so I was born in Oklahoma City, and I actually did not grow up in Oklahoma. I
Mm.
grew up in Summit, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Manhattan. So I grew up very disconnected from my Oklahoma roots. And it wasn't until my father started a business in Louisiana and I moved with my family to Baton Rouge. So from a suburb of Manhattan to Baton Rouge, the summer before 10th grade, which is another novel in and of itself. But after that move, we were much closer to Oklahoma. And my dad and I started making these trips over there where we'd fly to Tulsa, pick up my grandmother in Tulsa, drive up to Bartlesville, pick up my great aunt Boo Boo in Bartlesville. And then we would take them out to the cemetery in Claremore. And there's the Woodlawn Cemetery in Claremore, is where all my ancestors are buried. And I did not know any of them or anything about any of them. And I would just watch these two sisters literally like tottering amongst the headstones. They would have bags from Kmart of plastic flowers, and then they would get to arguing about whose favorite color was what because they wanted to put the right color flowers on each grave. And I just was, I think I was, what was I, 15? And that scene just, it's indelible, in my brain, just watching them and really trying to figure out why these sisters were so different. And it was in that cemetery that I first had the idea to write about them. So really, I've had the idea for this novel since high school.
It's amazing how a moment like that can have an impact and
Mhm.
just be like this big, long through line that you reflect back on and go back to and then write about later on. That's really amazing. Now, you tell us that Bessie Blackwell is a self-proclaimed spinster. Can you give us a little bit more details? Introduce us a little bit more to Bessie.
Yeah. So Bessie is from a family she was born in Oologah Indian Territory, which was Cherokee Indian Territory in the 1890s, and grew up above a general store. So my main character's family ran a general store. Nicknamed the Pack and Run. And so she grew up over this general store, and she is the eldest child in this family. And then her sister Florence came after her, and really, her story is one of that eldest child that ends up really having to take care of a lot of the people in her family. I think she's devoted a lot of her life to doing whatever needed to be done to take care of her family through some pretty serious ups and downs. And Bessie had gotten her teaching certificate and ends up putting that into use so she can sort of support and raise her younger brother for a time. They moved to Claremore, where she's a school teacher. And during that time, she has a clandestine relationship that really turns out to be very hurtful to her. And so, all of that, we kind of peel the onion, getting to those bits and pieces of her throughout the book to sort of understand why she has shut the door on love. She's just done. She, shuts the door, locks it, and throws away the key really in her 20s and just devotes her life to her family.
And you are a member of the Cherokee Nation as well. It seems like you weave in lots of different elements. You just gave the analogy like the
Mhm.
layers of an onion. Can you talk about just weaving all of your history and creating a book too that has different aspects, different genre aspects? It's family drama, it's a bit of romance, there's some humor in it as well. How did you pull all of that together?
Well, I think it starts with really with that character development. I've I've always known I was part Cherokee. There's never been a time in my life when I didn't know I was part Cherokee. It was a huge part of my dad's persona and really pride. Like he was so proud to be part Cherokee. And yet we had no family, no Cherokee traditions. We didn't make any Cherokee food. Nobody spoke Cherokee. And there were really very few stories about being Cherokee. There were lots of stories about being from Oklahoma, but there was very little about being Cherokee. And I think that was a big draw for me during the research, was to understand how Cherokee families got separated from that cultural identity. And I did a ton of research on that. A lot of that is not in this book. There's more Cherokee history in the second book. There's a sequel coming out to Henderson House, but it laid the groundwork for all of these characters and for this family. And so I think, when you really develop these characters and you're writing and you're in their voice, you can't help but for these pieces to come through because it's just part of who they are. And I think a lot of the language and some of the funny parts with their brother Eddie, Uncle Eddie, who's in the story, is very funny, and he's the storyteller. And I just think all that Midwestern vernacular and the expressions, all of that really, I think, came from me inhabiting these characters.
It is amazing when you start doing the research, how much of it doesn't necessarily end up on the page, but it informs so much of it. It informs those characters, like you said, and it forms the story. And then it gives you fodder for the next book. So this is not going to be the first Henderson House. Can you tell us a little bit about what people can expect in the next book?
There is a twist in Henderson House, so I have to be a little careful that I don't accidentally give away a spoiler. But there's a young man in Henderson House, Florence's son, Johnny, who ends up at the end of the book really needing to go on a quest to find a person. Trying not to give it away. And I think when I finished the book, I think a lot of people, they're definitely, there's later in life romance really between several characters, and people wanted to see where those relationships were going to go. I wanted to see where those relationships were going to go. And I wanted to spend more time with this young man, Johnny, and helping him kind of really put together his whole family. So that was the impetus to get started. And part of that journey that Johnny ends up taking in the second book, which is called Sequoia Road, is Johnny goes on a journey from Tulsa back to North Carolina to the Qualla boundary, which is where the eastern band of the Cherokee live. And in that process, he basically retraces sort of in reverse the northern route of the Trail of Tears that his ancestors traveled. So it's a big coming of age. So, again, you talked about mixing genres. So here we've still got sweet, nostalgic, great later in life romance going on. And now in the next book, we have this pretty incredible coming of age story mixed in there as well. So I guess I like to mix genres.
Yeah. Well, and that's reflective of our real life and the world that we live in. Another thing that you do so well is infuse humor into your writing. Can you talk about your style, finding your voice? Where does some of that come from?
So I'm from a theater family. I'm a theater rat. So I think I have heard polite criticism of my first novel is that it might be a little dialogue heavy, because I love to let my characters talk. And I think that does come from growing up in a family with a mother, who was really even still acting into her 80s, and a sister who was a professional actress. I'm a community theater person. So I'm very comfortable being in character and being in dialogue. And I've been growing as a writer to do more deep point of view, more introspection, sort of inner monologue is something I'm really growing into. But I think a big part of that just came from the fact that I'm very comfortable inhabiting a character. And I think that's why it worked for me to have 3 points of view. So in the first book, we have Mrs. Henderson and Bessie and her sister Florence. And it was easy for me. People say, how do you switch between them? And I loved it. It was really exciting to just get inside their heads. And, I certainly heard their voices very differently when I was writing it. And I have been incredibly blessed to have a super talented voice actor do the audiobook for Henderson House. It is top notch. She's amazing.
Yeah. And I love when I hear stories about authors, when they find their voice and when they start discovering things about themselves as well while they're writing. Can you tell us a little bit more? What is it that you learned about yourself that maybe you didn't realize before while you were writing Henderson House?
I don't know if it was while I was writing it as much as during the editing process with my publisher. I was really surprised at how hungry I was for criticism and how I loved the developmental editing process. I think for a lot of writers, particularly debut authors, that's the most terrifying part. They hate it. They feel terrible about themselves. And I was the total opposite. I loved it. I loved it that other professional people they cared. They wanted it to be better. I wanted it to be better. And I would say if you had asked me like, oh, how well do you take criticism? I'd have been like, yeah, a medium. And that was the biggest shock. I really love getting the feedback and going deep and changing things. And it's hard. Like, don't get me wrong. Like when someone asks you to make, and there were some little tweaks we made to the book right at the end that I think made it so much better. But it's like asking you've frosted a 3-layer cake and put the little roses on top. And then someone saying, could you just change that part of the filling right in there? And you're trying
we
to go
need
in
3 eggs, not 2 eggs. Start over.
Yeah. But I was happy to learn that about myself. I was very kind of frightened about what would that experience be like. And I loved it. I really loved it.
And you bring up such a great point because you're right. First-time authors oftentimes feel that they're creating everything all by themselves. It really does take a community and pulling in dev editors as well as other stages of editing too. Sometimes I talk to first-time authors who are surprised to know that they need more than just one type of editing on their book.
Yes.
What other advice or sage advice might you have for first-time authors?
Well, I think, it's hard for me to say this because it took me 40 years to sit down and start writing this story. But I will say, if you've got an idea inside you, just start by writing one scene. Don't be overwhelmed at the idea of, getting a whole book organized out of the starting gate. Write one scene. Maybe that turns into a chapter. Then you have another idea of a scene that might be in the novel and just start getting things down. I know for me, I had written about 7 chapters of the novel when I hit a wall and I didn't know how to get organized around a novel. I'd written fiction in college. I'd never done anything this large. And that second piece of advice would be find a writing community. I found a writers conference here in Vermont, and that was the game changer for me. I mean, I came away after a week with fellow writers all experiencing the same things I was experiencing and a great instructor. And I had a first draft less than a year later. So just get started, definitely seek help. And also, as you said, and seek, responses. With the second novel with Sequoia Road, I'm getting ready to get it out to some beta readers. I have some trusted readers. And again, just not being afraid to get feedback. It's still your project. Nobody's going to tell you have to change something, but it's interesting to see where people think it's lacking because you still have time to make it better. It's all about making it better.
Well, a lot of times we are too close to our own writing, or we know, for example, that backstory. We know why they're saying the things they're saying. And we just don't realize that it necessarily isn't on the page, or we haven't given the subtext or some of the clues like we think that we have. Now, it sounds
Mhm.
like you started Henderson House as a pantser, as somebody who is writing as they went along. I'm curious, are you writing the second book that way? Or are you plotting it a little bit? Where do you fall on the pantsing versus plotter scale?
Right. So I'm definitely a hybrid. When I got started, was not organized around it. And so that would be the pantser side, but I work better from an outline. So I do a lot of outlining. I had a career as a technical writer in the 90s. I wrote really long software manuals. um, and so I'm good with those tools and outlining really works for me. And so I'm definitely the higher, which is the plantser. I'm part plotter, part pantser, but I'm very open to letting my characters talk. So even though I have an outline, as I'm going, my characters surprise me all the time. I'll be writing a dinner scene and all of a sudden someone shows up at the door and literally I'm like, oh my gosh, who's at the door? I really am free with listening to my characters, but I do like an outline. So I'm a hybrid.
I like that term, plantser.
I'm
That's a
a
good one.
planter.
A plantser. Well, and I hear that from a lot of authors too. They feel that their characters are almost channeling through them. They're already speaking. There's things going on, and they don't even realize, in many cases, who's at the door, to your point, or what's going to necessarily happen next. What is it, Caren, that you want people to take away from Henderson House? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to walk away with when they're done reading this book?
I think I set out to write a heartwarming novel, and I think I wanted people to spend some time with some folks who were really trying to operate from a moral compass. Maybe they make the wrong decisions. Maybe they don't get it quite right. Um, but I feel like at their heart, there are a lot of people in this story who really care about getting things right, and I feel like sometimes we all need that. I read everything,
Mhm.
and every once in a while, I want a book like Henderson House. They always say, "Write the book you wanna read." And every once in a while, I really just want that heartwarming story that maybe restores my faith in people again, that we all make mistakes, but it's never too late to work through it and, to care about each other. And I think that is really I created sort of this found family of these people living at this boarding house who are really doing a beautiful job trying to take care of each other. And I really like that about this. I really like that about the novel. And I think a lot of people who have commented on it, they just love that warm feeling that it gives them. And we could all use more of that right now. So,
Yes, exactly. I mean, nowadays there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and sometimes a book that kind of just opens you up and brings you into this other world, this other time, this other place, and kind of comforts you. It's almost like a warm hug. Your book, in many ways, Caren, is like a nice, warm, heartfelt hug. And I gotta say, I love the cover. I keep holding this up, and I know you've got it behind you too. I got a little bit of a glare
mhm.
right now on my screen, but it's absolutely beautiful. Can you talk about the design of the cover and a little bit
Oh,
about the art?
sure. So my publisher works with a phenomenal book designer in the UK, a man named Tim Barber. So we'll give Tim a shout out. He designed the cover for Inkshares. And I had heard horror stories from other authors that, oh yeah, your publisher is just going to show you the cover and be like, hey, we all love it. Don't you love it? And you won't get any input. So armed with those stories, I put together like a 2-page document with samples of books I thought would feel good for Henderson House. Since this book is pre-World War II, in 1941, Pearl Harbor is about to happen in December. So the United States is participating in the war in Europe, but they haven't officially gone to war. And so I just wanted to make sure I didn't get that typical World War II cover with the back of women
Mhm.
and sort of airplanes flying overhead, because that wasn't this story. So I did put together this sort of 2-page discussion with some examples. And And Tim Barber came back with a cover that was really close, except it had apple blossoms on the bottom. And I'm like, there are no apple blossoms in the story. There are peonies in the story. And it had, I think, like pancakes at the top. And I'm like, this isn't a diner, it's a boarding house. And there's a story about Mrs. Henderson and how she interviews her lodgers over tea. So putting in the cup of tea. And we just worked on getting it, exactly right. But he was, it was part my vision, but also part his talent and his ability to listen. So I had a great experience with my cover design, and I just love it.
It is absolutely gorgeous. I know some people are like, we're listening to the show. We can't see the show. But this is why, folks, you should check us out on YouTube and subscribe to our channel, because we have the book covers. And you can always go and find the book as well. Caren, can you give folks your details? Where can they go to find out more about you, find your book?
Absolutely. So my website is Caren McVicker, and it's CarenMcVicker.com. I'm also on Instagram at Caren Writes. Again, that's Caren with a C. And on Facebook at Caren Simpson McVicker Writer. So those are great places to find me. And if you go to my website, it's easy to sign up for my e-newsletter. And I do call it my mostly monthly e-newsletter, because I don't send it out unless I have real news. So you can know if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll only get news from me, and only when I have real news to share.
And that's good, because sometimes we sign up for newsletters and we get a newsletter every other day. So it's nice to know that it's on an as needed basis. Absolutely. All right. Caren Simpson McVicker, it has been such a pleasure talking to you today about your marvelous book, Henderson House, and teasing us a little bit with the next book in the series. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for being with us as well. Again, make sure you join us on YouTube. You can hit the button, subscribe. That way you never miss a Books That Make You show on YouTube. As well, you can visit our website. That's booksthatmakeyou.com. You can follow us on Instagram as well as Facebook. And we are also on TikTok. And I am on X. So there's lots of ways to find us. Be sure as well, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a Webby award-winning newsletter. And we're just like Caren. We send it out once a month. Maybe we send out some breaking news if something really exciting has happened. And that way, too, you're never going to miss a show with wonderful authors like Caren. Until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The host and executive producer of the Books That Make You show is Desiree Duffy. Sound mastering and engineering by Dave Napox. Social media and content promotion by Siddhi Jahagirdar. Copywriting and editing by Mike Robinson. The Books That Make You show is an award-winning podcast produced by Black Chateau Enterprises.